You can handle all 5 of us? Said the beautiful Japanese POWs to the black American soldier. Spring, 1945. A lone soldier stands guard at a Philippine outpost. 5 Japanese women watch him from behind bamboo bars. What begins as a mockery becomes an unexpected test of humanity. When storms rage and floods threaten, he must make an impossible choice: follow orders or follow his conscience. "They're the enemy," his captain warns. But as days pass, something extraordinary happens. English words for Japanese ones, rice shared under moonlight, hymns hummed across enemy lines. Then a bullet flies, blood spills, and a woman who should hate him leaps to save his life. 20 years later, cherry trees bloom in Georgia soil, seeds carried across an ocean by hands once bound by war. What happens when mercy stands against duty? How can beauty grow from battlegrounds soaked in hate? And in a world torn apart by war, can the heart recognize what the mind refuses to see? Dawn broke over the Philippine coast, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The air felt thick with moisture, promising another hot day. Sergeant Caleb Turner wiped sweat from his brow as he stood at attention. The captain's jeep had just pulled up, kicking dust into the humid air. Caleb had been fighting for 2 years now. He'd seen things no man should see. The horrors of war had left lines on his face that made him look older than his 25 years. But through it all, he'd kept his faith. The small Bible in his pocket was worn from frequent reading. "Turner, I need to speak with you," Captain Hayes said, stepping out of the jeep. "Yes, sir," Caleb replied, his Georgia accent soft but clear. The captain led him away from the other soldiers. "I've got new orders for you, Sergeant." Caleb stood straight, wondering what was coming. The war was changing. Everyone knew it wouldn't last much longer, but that didn't make the days any easier. "You're staying behind," Captain Hayes said, looking at a clipboard. "The rest of the company is moving inland tomorrow." "Staying behind, sir?" Caleb asked. The captain nodded. "We've got a small POW holding site near the beach. 5 Japanese civilians, women who were working as nurses. Intelligence thinks they might have useful information, so they're being kept until transport arrives to take them to headquarters." Caleb waited, not understanding what this had to do with him. "You're going to guard them, Turner," the captain said. "Should be just a week, maybe 2 before transport comes?" "Just me, sir?" Caleb asked. Usually, guard duty meant at least 4 men. The captain looked uncomfortable. "Resources are tight. We need every man we can get for the push inland. These are just women, and they're behind a secure fence. It's a simple assignment." Caleb nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. I understand." As they walked back to the camp, some of the other soldiers noticed them talking. A group of men were loading supplies onto trucks. "Hey, Turner!" one called out. "What's the captain want with you?" Before Caleb could answer, Captain Hayes spoke up. "Turner's staying behind on guard duty." This caught everyone's attention. A tall soldier named Davis laughed. "Guard duty for what? Those Japanese women they brought in yesterday?" "That's right," the captain said. Davis looked at Caleb with a smirk. "1 colored guard for 5 Japanese women? You can handle all 5 of them, Turner?" The question hung in the air, part insult, part challenge. Caleb felt his jaw tighten, but kept his face calm. He'd faced worse than words during this war. And before the war, too, growing up in Georgia. "I'll do my duty, sir," he said to the captain, ignoring Davis. That night, Caleb packed his few belongings and prepared for his assignment. The other soldiers would leave at first light. He sat on his cot, reading his Bible by lamplight. The words gave him comfort, as they always did. "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy," he read softly. Morning came quickly. Caleb watched as the trucks filled with soldiers pulled away, heading inland. Davis gave him one last mocking salute as they left. Then there was silence, just the sound of waves in the distance and birds in the trees. Caleb walked to the small bamboo hut surrounded by wire fencing. It was a temporary structure, enough to keep people in, but not built to last. Through the wire, he could see 5 women sitting inside. They watched him with frightened eyes. He stood straight, rifle at his side. This was his duty now. 5 strangers who were supposed to be enemies, but who just looked scared and tired to him. "Lord, help me do what's right," he prayed silently. The morning heat grew stronger. Caleb checked his watch and knew it was time to bring food and water to the prisoners. He gathered supplies from the small storehouse: rice, dried fish, and canteens of fresh water. As he approached the hut, the women moved to the back wall, watching him with wary eyes. He unlocked the gate and stepped inside, setting the supplies on a small table. "Food," he said simply, pointing to the items. "Water." The women didn't move. One, who seemed older than the others, spoke softly in Japanese. The others nodded. Caleb tried to remember the few Japanese words he'd learned during the campaign. "Tabemono," he said carefully. "Food." The women looked surprised that he knew even one word of their language, but still, they didn't approach the food. The oldest woman spoke again, making eating motions and then clutching her throat, falling over dramatically. The message was clear. They thought the food was poisoned. Caleb shook his head. He took a small portion of rice, ate it himself, and drank from one of the canteens. Then he stepped back, leaving the supplies on the table. "It's safe," he said, knowing they probably didn't understand. "I'll come back later." He left the hut, locking the gate behind him. From his guard post, he could see them through the bamboo slats. After a long while, one of the younger women finally approached the food. She inspected it carefully before taking a small bite. Soon, the others joined her. Caleb felt relieved. At least they wouldn't go hungry. That evening, he brought more water and sat outside the hut, writing in his journal. He wrote about his day and his worries about this assignment. As darkness fell, he lit a lantern and continued writing. Inside the hut, the women whispered among themselves. Occasionally, he heard them say what sounded like his name, soft, half-fearful words in the growing darkness. Rain began to fall, light at first, then harder, drumming on the tin roof of the hut. Caleb moved under the small shelter of his guard post, watching as water began to pool on the ground. By morning, the rain hadn't stopped. If anything, it fell harder. The ground had turned to mud, and water was starting to seep into the POW hut. Caleb checked the perimeter barefoot, his boots too heavy in the thick mud. The women watched him through the wire as water dripped through their roof. One of them pointed up, trying to show him the leaks. Caleb knew the officer's shed was on higher ground and had a better roof. It was small, but it was dry. He made a quick decision. He unlocked the gate. "Come," he said, gesturing for them to follow him. They hesitated, looking at each other uncertainly. Lightning cracked nearby, making them jump. The oldest woman finally stood and nodded to the others. They followed Caleb through the rain to the shed. Inside, it was dry but cramped. The women huddled together, soaking wet and shivering. Caleb lit a small stove in the corner to provide warmth. The youngest woman looked at him with defiant eyes. "You can handle all 5 of us?" she asked in broken English, throwing his fellow soldiers' mocking words back at him. Caleb was surprised she could speak English at all. even just a few words. He thought carefully before answering. "Ma'am, I aim to," he said quietly. "I aim to keep you safe until transport comes." The women whispered among themselves again. Caleb didn't know what they were saying, but the tension in the air seemed to ease slightly. As the storm continued, they settled into an uneasy truce. Caleb stayed by the door, giving them space. They remained huddled together on the far side of the small room. Outside, the rain fell in sheets. The next day dawned clear and bright. The storm had passed, leaving puddles of water everywhere. Caleb escorted the women back to their hut, which had mostly dried out in the morning sun. Later that day, he built a small fire outside to cook. The supply stores had dwindling food, just some rice, a few cans of vegetables, and a tin of biscuits. He divided everything equally, making 5 portions for the women and 1 for himself. He brought the food to the hut, and this time stayed as they ate. He sat on a small stool, eating his own portion with chopsticks he'd carved from bamboo. He struggled with them, dropping rice. One of the women, younger than the oldest but older than the others, watched him with amusement in her eyes. Suddenly, she laughed. It was a small sound, like bells in the quiet afternoon. Caleb looked up, surprised. She made a motion with her hands, showing him how to hold the chopsticks properly. "Like this," she said in Japanese, demonstrating. Caleb adjusted his grip and managed to pick up some rice. "Thank you," he said. The woman nodded. "Arigato," she said, teaching him the Japanese word. "Arigato," Caleb repeated. For a brief moment, there was harmony in the small hut. Just people sharing food, teaching, and learning. Then the sound of an approaching jeep broke the silence. Caleb quickly stood up and stepped outside. A patrol was passing by, 2 jeeps with soldiers heading toward the beach. They slowed when they saw Caleb. "Everything under control here, Sergeant?" an officer called out. "Yes, sir," Caleb replied, standing at attention. The soldiers in the jeeps peered at the hut curiously. Through the open door, they could see the women eating. Some of the men exchanged looks. "Looks cozy," one of them commented with a smirk. The officer gave Caleb a hard look. "Remember, they're prisoners, not guests, Turner." "Yes, sir," Caleb said again, keeping his face neutral. The jeeps drove on, leaving a cloud of dust behind them. Caleb watched until they disappeared, then returned to the hut. The mood had changed. The women had stopped eating and were watching him warily again. That night, Caleb sat at his guard post, writing in his journal by lantern light. "Did what I thought was right today," he wrote. "But I wonder if kindness will cost me more than following every rule to the letter." He looked up at the stars, visible now that the storm clouds had cleared. In Georgia, his mother would be looking at these same stars. He missed home, missed his family, and his church. War made everything complicated, even simple human kindness. 2 evenings later, dark clouds gathered again on the horizon. Caleb watched them with concern. The weather changed quickly here, and the last storm had been fierce. By nightfall, the wind was howling, bending the palm trees and rattling the hut's walls. Rain began to fall, hard and driving. Through the wind, Caleb heard a cracking sound, one of the support posts of the POW hut giving way. Without hesitation, he ran to the hut, unlocked the gate, and led the women once more to the officer's shed. This time, they didn't hesitate to follow him. Inside, they huddled together again as the storm raged. Caleb tried to give them as much space as possible in the small room. He pulled a blanket from his pack and offered it to them. The oldest woman, whom he'd come to think of as their leader, took it with a small bow. "Thank you," she said in heavily accented English. "You're welcome," Caleb replied. My name is Caleb, he added, touching his chest. The woman nodded. I am Aiko, she said. She pointed to each of the other women in turn. Reina, Yumi, Sachiko, Nara. Caleb repeated each name, trying to pronounce them correctly. The women seemed pleased by his effort. Outside, the storm grew stronger. Rain pounded on the roof, and wind howled around the corners of the shed. Over the noise, they heard the sound of an engine. Headlights appeared through the rain, a jeep struggling through the mud. Caleb felt his heart sink as he recognized Captain Vance's vehicle. Stay here, he told the women, and stepped outside into the downpour. Captain Vance was already getting out of his jeep, holding a tarp over his head. Turner, he shouted over the wind. What's going on here? Storm damage to the POW hut, sir, Caleb reported. I moved the prisoners to safer shelter. Vance pushed past him and looked inside the shed. His face darkened when he saw the women huddled near Caleb's cot. What the hell do you think you're doing? He demanded, turning on Caleb. Prisoners near your sleeping quarters? Do you know how this looks? Sir, the hut was coming apart in the storm, Caleb explained. I was concerned for their safety. Their safety? Vance spat the words. They're enemy prisoners, Turner. They're people, sir, Caleb said before he could stop himself. Vance's face grew red. Report to me at 0600 hours tomorrow, Sergeant. You're facing charges of misconduct and fraternization with the enemy. Caleb stood at attention, rain soaking through his uniform. Yes, sir? Vance got back in his jeep. And get those prisoners secured properly. The hut isn't safe in this storm, sir, Caleb said. Vance hesitated, then swore under his breath. Fine, but you stay outside, you hear me? Outside. Yes, sir, Caleb said again. As Vance's jeep disappeared into the night, Caleb stood in the rain for a long moment. Tomorrow would bring trouble, he knew. But tonight, at least, the women would be safe from the storm. Inside the shed, the women watched him through the window, their faces a mixture of fear and gratitude. Caleb found a tarp and set it up outside the door, creating a small shelter where he could keep watch through the night. As the storm continued to rage, Caleb prayed. For guidance, for strength, and for the wisdom to do what was right, even when it wasn't easy. Dawn came gray and misty. The storm had passed, but the ground was a sea of mud. Caleb, who had barely slept, prepared to meet Captain Vance. The women watched silently as he straightened his uniform and cleaned his boots as best he could. Aiko stepped forward and handed him a small piece of cloth, a handkerchief she had somehow kept clean and dry. Thank you, Caleb said, touched by the gesture. He escorted the women back to their hut, which had survived the storm better than he'd feared. Then he made his way to the meeting place, a small clearing that served as the camp yard. Captain Vance was already there, along with 2 other officers who would serve as witnesses. Vance's face was stern as Caleb approached and saluted. Sergeant Turner, Vance began, you stand accused of misconduct and fraternization with enemy prisoners. How do you respond? Caleb stood straight, looking the captain in the eye. Sir, I was protecting the prisoners from a dangerous situation. The hut was coming apart in the storm. They could have been injured or escaped. And was it necessary to have them in the officers' quarters? Vance demanded. It was the only sturdy shelter available, sir, Caleb replied calmly. I remained outside as much as possible, only coming in to check on their welfare. One of the other officers spoke up. The regulations do allow for emergency measures to protect prisoners, Captain. Vance frowned. There's also the matter of sharing food with them, eating together. I was showing them the food was safe, sir. Caleb explained. They were afraid it was poisoned. The officers conferred quietly. Caleb stood at attention, waiting. Finally, Vance turned back to him. We need to check with higher command on this, he said. But our radio is down from the storm. Until we get word, you will continue your duty, but with restrictions. No visitors to this camp, no communication with anyone except through official channels, and double guard duties. Yes, sir, Caleb said, relieved it wasn't worse. Dismissed, Vance said sharply. Caleb saluted and turned to go. And Turner, Vance called after him. Remember they're the enemy. Don't forget that. Caleb nodded but didn't speak. In his heart, he wasn't sure he saw enemies anymore. Just 5 women, far from home, caught in a war they hadn't chosen, much like himself. He returned to his post, feeling the weight of the women's eyes on him through the bamboo slats. They seemed to know he'd face trouble because of them. Yet there was no resentment in him, only a quiet determination to do his duty with kindness. The days that followed were quiet. The sun returned, drying the mud. Caleb repaired fences and reinforced the hut. The women began to help with small tasks, washing clothes, preparing food. It wasn't ordered or expected, but it happened naturally. During these days, they began to exchange words. Japanese for English, English for Japanese. Small bridges built with language. Water? Caleb would say, pointing. Mizu, they would answer. Bread, he would teach. Pan, they would repeat. And then one day, Aiko taught him a word he hadn't heard before. Kokoro, she said, placing her hand over her heart. Kokoro, Caleb repeated. What does it mean? Heart, Aiko said in English. Spirit, soul. Caleb nodded, understanding. Kokoro, he said again, touching his own heart. At dusk, they would sometimes hum songs as they worked. Caleb recognized one melody. Sakura, a song about cherry blossoms. It reminded him of the hymns sung in his church back home, full of longing and hope. One evening, as they sat outside watching the sunset, Caleb began to hum Amazing Grace softly. To his surprise, the women listened intently, and soon Yumi, who had the clearest voice, began to hum along. Their voices blended in the twilight, a harmony of east and west under a canopy of emerging stars. In that moment, Caleb felt a peace he hadn't known in a long time. War had taken so much from everyone, but here, in this unlikely place, something beautiful was growing. Understanding, respect, perhaps even friendship. But the world outside their small camp was still at war, and reality would soon intrude on their fragile peace. 3 days after the storm, a supply wagon arrived at the camp. Caleb greeted the driver, a corporal named Jenkins, who seemed surprised to find just one guard at the post. Thought there'd be more of you out here, Jenkins said, jumping down from the wagon. How you managing with them prisoners all by yourself? Managing fine, Caleb replied, helping unload the supplies. Jenkins leaned closer. Heard rumors in town, Japanese spies in the hills watching troop movements, commands on high alert. Caleb glanced toward the hut where the women were gathering laundry. These aren't spies, just nurses who got caught up in the fighting. Jenkins shrugged. All the same to some folks. Japanese is Japanese? He looked at the women with narrowed eyes. Best keep your rifle loaded, Turner. War ain't over yet. After the wagon departed, Caleb noticed the women seemed anxious. They huddled together, speaking in hushed tones. Their eyes followed him with new fear. What's wrong? He asked, approaching slowly. Raina, the quiet one who had taught him to use chopsticks, spoke hesitantly. American soldiers? Kill us? Caleb realized they had understood parts of his conversation with Jenkins. No, he said firmly. No one will hurt you. I promise. But that night, distant gunfire echoed from the hills. The patrol was hunting something or someone. Caleb loaded his rifle and sat outside the hut, watchful in the darkness. Inside, he could hear the women whispering fearfully. "It's okay," he called softly. "Just patrol. You're safe here." Whether they understood his words or just his tone, the whispers quieted. Caleb continued his vigil, caught between duty and the promise he'd made to protect these women until transport came. Morning brought calm and clear skies. To ease the tension, Caleb decided to teach more English words. "Bread," he said, holding up a small loaf from the supplies. "Bread," they repeated. "Water," he said, pointing to a canteen. "Water," they echoed. Then he touched his chest. "Friend," he said. The women exchanged glances, unsure. Caleb pointed to himself, then to them. "Friend," he repeated. Aiko, always the bravest, stepped forward. "Friend," she said carefully. Then she taught him the Japanese word, tomodachi. "Tomodachi," Caleb repeated, feeling the unfamiliar word shape his smile. Aiko then taught him another word. "Kokoro," she said, placing her hand over her heart. "Heart," Caleb translated, remembering what she'd taught him days before. Aiko nodded, pleased. "Strong kokoro," she said, pointing to Caleb. "Kind kokoro." The simple language lesson turned into laughter as they struggled with pronunciations and made silly mistakes. The fear from the previous night melted away in the morning sunshine. During this time, Caleb noticed Raina watching him intently. Later, he discovered why. On the wall of the hut, she had pinned a charcoal drawing, his portrait captured with surprising skill. "This is very good," Caleb said, amazed by the detail. His own eyes looked back at him from the paper, thoughtful and kind. Raina bowed slightly, pleased by his praise. Caleb found a pencil and paper and wrote out a verse he carried in his heart. "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." He pinned it beside her drawing. "What means?" Raina asked. "Treat people with kindness," Caleb explained simply. "The way you want to be treated." The next challenge came 2 days later, when the camp's well began running low. They would need to fetch water from the stream a 1/4 mile away. "We go together," Caleb told the women, handing them empty containers. Protocol required that prisoners be restrained when moved, but Caleb couldn't bring himself to bind these women who had shown him nothing but cooperation. Instead, he simply asked for their word. "Promise? Stay together? No run?" he asked. Aiko nodded solemnly. "Promise," she said, and the others echoed her. Their small group walked to the stream, Caleb leading with his rifle slung over his shoulder rather than pointed at them. The women filled containers with fresh water, talking quietly among themselves. For a moment, it felt almost normal, as if they weren't prisoners in guard, but just people helping each other. The illusion shattered on their return journey. A local Filipino man crossed their path, his face darkening when he saw the Japanese women. He spat on the ground and shouted something Caleb didn't understand. The women tensed. Yumi, the youngest, shrank back in fear. Caleb stepped between them and the angry man. "Please move along," he said firmly. "These are prisoners under United States Army protection." The man glared but backed away, muttering words that needed no translation. Caleb felt the women's eyes on him as they continued walking. He'd protected them, not because they were prisoners who needed to be kept secure, but because they were humans who deserved dignity. That evening, Caleb found a small bundle of wildflowers placed carefully beside his helmet. No words accompanied this gift, but he understood its meaning: gratitude, recognition, perhaps even friendship. The night brought a different gift. Mail from headquarters had finally arrived. Among official dispatches was a letter for Caleb, worn and wrinkled from its long journey. His mother's handwriting brought an immediate lump to his throat. He sat outside under the stars to read it. The letter was dated months ago, but her words reached across time and space to comfort him. "We pray for you every Sunday at church," she'd written. "Pastor Miller leads us, and we all say your name. God is watching over you, son. I know it in my heart." Caleb read parts of the letter aloud to himself, finding comfort in hearing his mother's words in his own voice. He didn't realize Yumi had approached until she spoke. "Church?" she asked softly. "What is church?" Caleb looked up, surprised. "Church is where people pray together," he explained, "where we learn about forgiveness and love." Yumi sat on the ground near him, curious rather than afraid. "Your mother? She is in church?" "Yes," Caleb said, smiling at the thought. "Every Sunday, wearing her best dress and singing loud enough for the angels to hear." "Angels?" Yumi asked. "Messengers from heaven," Caleb explained. "They watch over people." Soon the other women joined them, drawn by the quiet conversation. Caleb found himself explaining his faith as simply as he could, using the few Japanese words he knew and many hand gestures. "God loves everyone," he said, spreading his arms wide. "Japanese, American, everyone." "Even in war?" Sachiko asked skeptically. Caleb nodded. "Especially in war. When it's hardest to love, that's when love matters most." They sat in silence for a moment, absorbing this idea. Then Aiko asked if they could pray together. Caleb hesitated only briefly. This wasn't in any military protocol, he knew, but it felt right. He nodded and lit a small lantern. In the gentle glow, they formed a circle. Caleb bowed his head and prayed simply, "God, watch over us all. Help us find peace. Amen." The women repeated, "Amen," the word new on their tongues but said with reverence. What none of them knew was that outside the fence, a villager passing by had stopped to watch. In the dim light, he saw Americans and Japanese together, heads bowed. He didn't hear Caleb's prayer for peace. He saw only what he feared: conspiracy, enemies plotting together. By morning, this misunderstanding would spread, reaching ears eager to believe the worst. The following day, a military truck rumbled into camp. Lieutenant Dawson, a stern officer Caleb had met only once before, stepped out with 2 armed guards. "Sergeant Turner," he said without greeting. "I need to speak with you privately." Caleb followed him to the supply shed, aware of the women watching anxiously from their hut. "There are reports," Dawson began bluntly, "that you're getting too friendly with the prisoners. Some locals say you're aiding enemy spies." "That's not true, sir," Caleb said calmly. "I've treated the prisoners humanely as regulations require. They're not spies. They're nurses." "That's what they want you to think," Dawson countered. "The Japanese are tricky. They'll use sympathy, make you lower your guard." Caleb kept his face neutral. "With respect, sir, I haven't lowered my guard. No escape attempts, no security breaches. I've maintained order while treating them with basic human dignity." Dawson studied him for a long moment. "I hope that's true, Turner. Because if it's not, if you're being played, it won't just be them facing consequences." He turned to leave. "Expect further inspection. Soon." After Dawson departed, Caleb returned to the hut. The women had heard enough to be frightened. Their eyes asked questions he couldn't answer. "It's okay," he said, trying to sound confident. "Just routine." But Aiko wasn't fooled. "Trouble," she said. "For you. Because of us." Caleb shook his head. Not your fault. He smiled reassuringly, though worry gnawed at him. That night, after the women had gone to sleep, Caleb wrote a detailed report to headquarters in Manila. He described the true conditions at the camp, the women's cooperation, their status as medical personnel. He sealed it carefully, hoping truth would be enough. Before sleeping, he knelt in prayer, something his mother had taught him to do since childhood. In the quiet darkness, he asked for guidance, for protection for himself and the 5 women now in his care. From her sleeping mat, Aiko watched through half-closed eyes. "Kokoro, strong," she whispered as Caleb finally lay down to rest. Sunday dawned bright and clear. Though no church bells rang in this remote camp, Caleb felt the familiar pull of Sabbath worship. After morning checks, he approached the women with an idea. "Today is Sunday," he said. "In America, we go to church. Would you like to have a small service here?" The women looked confused but curious. Caleb pulled his worn Bible from his pocket. "I can read. We can sing songs." They agreed, perhaps more from curiosity than faith. Caleb arranged a small circle of crates for them to sit on in the shade of a palm tree. He opened his Bible and found a passage he thought they might understand, even with the language barrier. "The Lord is my shepherd," he read from Psalm 23. "I shall not want." Though the words were unfamiliar to them, his gentle voice carried the meaning. When he finished, there was a thoughtful silence. Then Yumi began to hum a melody. Not a hymn, but something soft and hopeful. The other women joined in, creating harmony that needed no translation. Laughter followed when Yumi tried to say shepherd and stumbled over the unfamiliar word. Soon they were all attempting it, their failed pronunciations bringing more laughter. In that moment of shared joy, Caleb felt something he'd not expected to find in war. Connection. "Feels like family," he said quietly, the words slipping out before he could catch them. The women didn't understand his exact words, but they seemed to sense his meaning. Nara, who rarely spoke, reached out and briefly touched his hand, a gesture of agreement that crossed all barriers. Their peaceful Sunday wouldn't last. 2 nights later, rifle cracks shattered the darkness. Caleb jumped from his cot, grabbing his weapon. Through the window, he saw flashlight beams, cutting through the night, heading toward the camp. "Stay inside," he ordered the women, who were now awake and frightened. "I'll find out what's happening." Before he could step outside, the door burst open. American soldiers rushed in, rifles raised. Their sergeant, a man Caleb didn't recognize, pointed his weapon directly at Caleb. "Stand down, Turner. Hands where I can see them." "What's going on?" Caleb asked, slowly raising his hands. "We've got reports of collusion with enemy agents," the sergeant snapped. "These women have been signaling to Japanese scouts in the hills." "That's not true," Caleb protested. "They haven't left this compound except under my direct supervision." "Save it!" the sergeant barked. "Men, get the prisoners outside. We're taking them in for questioning." The soldiers began roughly herding the terrified women toward the door. Sachiko stumbled, and a private grabbed her arm roughly. "Easy!" Caleb shouted. "They're not resisting!" "This isn't your call anymore," the sergeant said, pushing Caleb back. "You're under suspicion of aiding the enemy." "I want to see your orders," Caleb demanded. "These prisoners are my responsibility until properly relieved. I need command verification." The sergeant hesitated, caught off guard by Caleb's authoritative tone. In that moment of uncertainty, one of the younger privates grew nervous. Seeing movement as Aiko turned to look back at Caleb, he raised his rifle. Caleb saw it happening, as if in slow motion. The private's finger tightened on the trigger. Without thinking, Caleb lunged forward, but Aiko moved faster. She leaped between them just as the rifle cracked. The bullet grazed her shoulder, spinning her around. She collapsed with a cry of pain. Caleb caught her before she hit the ground, blood staining her simple shirt. "Medic!" Caleb shouted, lowering Aiko gently. "She needs a medic now!" Searchlights swept across the compound, illuminating the chaotic scene. The sergeant swore, realizing the situation had spiraled out of control. "Jenkins, get the first aid kit," he ordered. "The rest of you, secure the area." In the harsh white light, Caleb knelt beside Aiko, pressing a cloth to her wound. "Stay with me," he murmured. "You're going to be okay." Her eyes, filled with pain but clear, fixed on his face. She whispered something he couldn't hear. He leaned closer. "Why?" she asked. "Why help enemy?" Caleb shook his head. "Not enemy," he said softly. "Friend, Tomodachi, remember?" A faint smile touched her lips before the medic pushed Caleb aside to tend to her wound. The next hours passed in a blur. Aiko was carried inside and treated. The bullet had only grazed her, painful, but not life-threatening. The other women huddled nearby, watching anxiously as the medic worked. Meanwhile, the sergeant placed Caleb under arrest. "For assisting the enemy," he stated formally. "I was doing my duty," Caleb replied, too tired to argue further. They locked him in the supply shed, posting a guard outside. Through the thin walls, he could hear the women crying softly in the distance. That night, as rain began to fall again, rhythmic against the roof, Caleb prayed. "Lord," he whispered, "why does mercy always cost so much?" No answer came except the steady drumming of raindrops like heartbeats in the darkness. Morning arrived with drizzling rain. 2 soldiers escorted Caleb to a temporary holding cell set up in what had been the camp's small office. He learned that Major Kendrick, an officer from divisional headquarters, had arrived to investigate the incident. Kendrick was an older man with gray at his temples and eyes that had seen too much war. He sat across from Caleb, a folder open before him. "Sergeant Turner," he began, "you've created quite a stir. Reports of fraternization, possible espionage, now a shooting. What exactly has been going on at this camp?" Caleb straightened in his chair. "Sir, I've been following regulations regarding the humane treatment of prisoners. These women are civilian medical personnel, not combatants. They've cooperated fully during their detention." Kendrick studied him. "The local patrol has a different view. They claim you've been holding religious services with them, sharing food, teaching them English." "Yes, sir, I have," Caleb admitted. "But nothing that compromised security. They're people far from home, caught in a war. I treated them with dignity." The major leaned back. "Dignity," he repeated thoughtfully. "Not a word we hear much in war, Turner." "Maybe we should, sir," Caleb said quietly. A ghost of a smile touched Kendrick's face. "Maybe so." He closed the folder. "I'll be interviewing each of the women separately. Until then, you remain under restricted movement." "Sir, how is Aiko, the woman who was shot?" Caleb asked. "She'll recover," Kendrick replied. "Brave thing she did, jumping in front of that rifle." "Yes, sir, she is brave." Kendrick gave him a long look. "You care what happens to them, don't you, Turner? Not just as a duty." Caleb met his gaze steadily. "I do, sir." "That's either very foolish or very wise," Kendrick said. "I haven't decided which yet." Throughout the day, Kendrick interviewed each woman with the help of a Japanese-American interpreter. Despite the language barrier they'd faced with Caleb, all 5 insisted on the same points. Sergeant Turner had fed them, protected them, and never harmed them. Aiko, her shoulder bandaged but her spirit unbroken, spoke the most clearly. Though Caleb wasn't present for her testimony, he later learned she had described everything: their shelter during the storm, the shared hymn singing, his protection at the stream. When the interviews were complete, Kendrick ordered a delay in any proceedings. "Manila needs to make the final decision," he told Caleb. "Until then, you'll remain under supervision, but not confined." That evening, as dusk fell over the camp, Caleb sat alone on a bench outside the temporary barracks. Through the compound, he could see the women's hut, now guarded by soldiers from Kendrick's unit. From this distance, he caught a glimpse of Aiko standing at the window, her bandaged shoulder visible in the fading light. When she saw him looking, she smiled faintly. Caleb felt a weight lift slightly from his heart. She was alive. They were all safe, at least for now. Whatever happened to him, court-martial, demotion, prison, he had done what he believed was right. In his hands, he held his Bible, the pages worn from countless readings. He turned to a passage that had always given him strength. "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy." The words, ancient but ever new, reminded him why he had chosen the path of kindness, even when it led through danger. As darkness fell completely, he looked up at the first stars appearing in the sky, the same stars that shone over Georgia, over Japan, over all the war-torn places where people longed for peace. Somewhere in that vastness, Caleb believed, there was a God who understood that enemies were only enemies until someone dared to see them as friends. The following week brought unexpected changes. Caleb, though still under supervision, was treated with increasing respect by Kendrick's men. The women, no longer considered high-risk prisoners, were allowed more freedom within the compound. Through a guard who had become somewhat friendly, Caleb received a surprise: 5 delicately folded paper cranes, made from scraps of paper the women had salvaged. He recognized the Japanese tradition. These cranes symbolized healing and hope. He hung them carefully above his cot, a rainbow of colors against the drab military green. Each night before sleeping, he would look at them and remember why he'd chosen mercy over blind obedience. News from beyond their small camp filtered in slowly. Rumors of peace talks, of islands recaptured, of the war perhaps ending soon. For the people in the compound, American and Japanese alike, these distant events held their futures in balance. One afternoon, a local villager approached the camp gates. Instead of the hostility Caleb had come to expect, the man brought a small basket of fruit, a peace offering. Through halting English, he explained that he had watched Caleb's treatment of the women and had been moved by it. Others in the village were changing their minds too. "War make all crazy," the villager said simply. "You show different way." Caleb accepted the gift with gratitude. Later, he shared the fruit with the women, who received it with surprised delight. Small moments of grace in the midst of conflict. These were the victories that would never appear in military reports, but might matter most in the end. As July turned to August, a sense of waiting filled the camp. Waiting for orders, for decisions about Caleb's fate, for news of the wider war. Yet in this waiting, a strange peace had settled over them all. The women continued, making paper cranes, dozens now, strung together and hung in their windows. Even the guards commented on their beauty, catching the sunlight like fragments of hope. And Caleb, though uncertain about his future, found himself strangely content. He had followed his conscience and his faith. Whatever came next, he would face it knowing he had not let war strip away his humanity. "Maybe the Lord's not done yet," he whispered one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors no battle could dim. Around him, the paper cranes swayed gently in the breeze, as if nodding in silent agreement. Mid-August arrived with scorching heat and unexpected news. A jeep roared into camp, kicking up dust as it skidded to a halt. The driver, a young corporal, jumped out waving a telegram. "Major Kendrick!" he shouted. "Urgent news from headquarters!" Everyone in the compound stopped what they were doing. Caleb, who had been repairing a fence under supervision, straightened up. The women paused in their laundry work, watching with wide eyes. Kendrick emerged from his temporary office and took the telegram. As he read, his face changed, surprise, then something like relief washing over his features. "Gather everyone," he ordered. "I have an announcement." Word spread quickly. Soldiers dropped their duties and assembled in the yard. The 5 women were brought out, standing together in a small group. Caleb stood apart, still technically under restriction. Major Kendrick held up the telegram. "I've just received word," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet compound. "Japan has surrendered. The war is over." For a moment, no one moved or spoke. The words seemed too big, too impossible after years of fighting. Then someone let out a whoop, and suddenly cheers erupted. Men threw their helmets in the air. Some fell to their knees in prayer. Others wept openly. Caleb looked toward the women. They stood frozen, tears streaming down their faces. Tears of joy? Relief? Uncertainty about what would happen to them now? Perhaps all of these. Kendrick raised his hands for quiet. "There's more," he said when the noise subsided. "In light of the surrender, all prisoners of war will be processed for repatriation as soon as possible." He turned to Caleb. "And Sergeant Turner, all pending charges against you are suspended pending review. You're released from restriction effective immediately." Caleb felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "Thank you, sir," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion welling inside him. As the crowd dispersed, talking excitedly about going home, Caleb approached the women. They looked at him with questions in their eyes. "You're going home," he told them, smiling. "Back to Japan, to your families." They understood enough to grasp his meaning. Aiko, her shoulder healing well, stepped forward. "Free?" she asked. "All of us?" Caleb nodded. "All of us." Her hand found his and squeezed briefly. In that simple touch was gratitude, relief, and something more. A connection that had defied the boundaries of enemy lines. The next 2 days were a flurry of activity. Preparations for the women's transport to a larger processing center were underway. They would leave by boat, the first step in their long journey home. On their final morning, Caleb gathered small gifts, packets of sugar saved from his rations, a bar of soap, a pencil for Raina. Simple things, but precious in a world still recovering from war. He brought these to their hut, now free of its fence and guard post. The women had packed their few belongings in small bundles. When they saw Caleb, they gathered around him eagerly. "These are for you," he said, handing out his modest gifts. "For the journey home." They accepted with deep bows of thanks. Then Aiko stepped forward, holding something wrapped in a scrap of cloth. She presented it to Caleb formally. "For you," she said, "to remember." Caleb unwrapped the cloth carefully. Inside was a beautiful piece of embroidery, somehow created from threads pulled from their own clothing. In carefully stitched letters was the word kokoro, heart. "We not forget," Aiko said, placing her hand over her heart. "Sergeant Caleb, good kokoro." The others nodded in agreement. Sachiko, who rarely spoke, added softly, "Friend." Caleb felt his throat tighten. "I won't forget you either," he promised. The truck arrived an hour later to take them to the harbor. Caleb accompanied them, helping with their bundles. At the checkpoint, he had to stop. Only official transport personnel could go further. The women climbed down from the truck, looking back at him. For a moment, no one spoke. What could words do now, at the end of such an unexpected journey together? Caleb saluted them formally, soldier to soldier. They bowed in return, the gesture filled with respect. "Safe journey," he said. "God be with you." They might not have understood his exact words, but they understood his heart. As they turned to board the small boat that would take them to the larger transport ship, Aiko looked back one last time. "America," she said, pointing to Caleb. Then she pointed to herself and the others. "Japan." Finally, she brought her hands together, fingers interlaced. "Friends." "Friends," Caleb agreed. "Tomodachi." The boat pulled away from the dock, carrying the 5 women toward home. Caleb stood watching until they were just tiny figures waving against the vast blue sea. He continued watching until only gulls remained, wheeling above the waves. Something had changed in him during these weeks. He had come to the Philippines as a soldier, trained to see clear lines between ally and enemy. He would leave with the understanding that humanity ran deeper than any national boundary. Weeks later, Caleb found himself on a troop transport ship bound for San Francisco. The war's end had set everything in motion. Thousands of soldiers returning home, families waiting to reunite, a world trying to heal its wounds. In the quiet hours at sea, Caleb wrote long letters to his mother. He told her about the 5 women, not mentioning their beauty, but focusing on their grace and strength. He described how they had taught him Japanese words, how they had made paper cranes while waiting for peace. His fellow soldiers, many of whom had once mocked his assignment as a lone guard for 5 geishas, now listened to his stories with quiet attention. The war had hardened them all, but perhaps it had also taught them to recognize courage when they saw it, even in unexpected places. "You did right by them, Turner," said Peterson, a tough sergeant from Montana. "Not everyone would have." "Just did what my mama taught me," Caleb replied with a small smile. "Treat folks like you want to be treated." "Your mama raised a good man," Peterson said, and there was no mockery in his voice now. The ship's horn echoed across the gray morning as the California coastline came into view. After years away, Caleb was finally returning to American soil. As the other men crowded the rails, excited to see home, Caleb stood slightly apart, staring eastward. In his pocket, he carried the embroidered cloth with Kokoro stitched in careful letters. In his heart, he carried a prayer that 5 women were finding their way safely back to a Japan now changed forever by defeat. "Watch over them, Lord," he whispered, the words carried away by the sea breeze. "Let them find peace." 2 months later, on a crisp autumn day, Caleb stepped off a bus in his hometown of Augusta, Georgia. The war might have ended, but its effects lingered everywhere. In the faded gold star flags hanging in windows, in the victory gardens still producing vegetables, in the faces of people who had waited and worried for years. His mother stood in front of the small Baptist church where the bus had stopped. When she saw him, she let out a cry and ran forward, her Sunday hat flying off in her haste. Caleb caught her in his arms, lifting her off the ground in a hug that tried to make up for all the years apart. "My boy," she kept saying through tears. "My boy's come home." Behind her, the congregation had poured out of the church building. Pastor Reeves stood beaming on the steps, Bible in hand. Neighbors and friends pressed forward to welcome Caleb back. There were questions, of course. Everyone wanted to hear about the war, about the islands and battles they'd only read about in newspapers. Some looked at his sergeant's stripes with pride. Others nodded respectfully at the ribbons on his uniform. But there were whispers, too. Caleb overheard snippets as he greeted people. "Guarding Jap prisoners? Heard he got too friendly with them? Can you imagine? Pastor Reeves must have heard the whispers too, because he raised his hands for silence. "Brothers and sisters," he called out, "let's welcome our son Caleb properly, with a prayer of thanksgiving for his safe return and for the peace God has granted. Our world." He gestured Caleb forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. "And let us remember the words of our Lord Jesus. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy." Our Caleb here has seen the worst of war, yet kept his heart pure. That's a victory greater than any battle. The whispers died away. In their place came amens and nods of agreement. Caleb felt his mother squeeze his hand, her eyes shining with pride. Later that day, after the welcome celebrations had quieted, Caleb walked alone behind the church. The small cemetery where his father lay was peaceful under autumn leaves. He stood for a long time at the grave, telling his father silently about his experiences, his growth, his changed heart. Near the fence that bordered the cemetery, Caleb noticed a patch of freshly turned earth. Someone had been planting. Curious, he walked over and was surprised to find several slender saplings taking root. "Your mother planted those?" Pastor Reeves said, appearing beside him. "Cherry trees. Said you'd understand why." Caleb touched one of the delicate saplings gently. "I do understand," he said softly. "She mentioned you'd brought seeds from overseas. Said they were a gift." Caleb nodded, remembering Iko pressing the small packet into his hand. "From a friend," he said simply. Pastor Reeves didn't press for more details. Instead, he looked at the young trees thoughtfully. "They'll bloom in spring," he said. "Japanese cherry blossoms in a Georgia churchyard. God works in mysterious ways, doesn't he?" "Yes, sir, he surely does," Caleb agreed. As winter passed and spring approached, Caleb settled back into civilian life. He took a job at the local lumber yard, using skills he'd learned in the army. On Sundays, he sang in the church choir, his deep voice carrying the old hymns he'd missed so much during the war. But part of him remained connected to those strange, peaceful weeks in the Philippines. He kept the embroidered kokoro cloth in his Bible, a reminder of promises kept and bridges built across enemy lines. Early one spring morning, the mail carrier brought an envelope with foreign stamps. Caleb's hands trembled slightly as he recognized the Japanese characters alongside his address. Inside was a letter written in careful, clearly practiced English. "Dear Sergeant Caleb Turner, we have arrived safely in Kyoto. Our families welcomed us home with many tears. Japan is very changed, very damaged, but we are rebuilding slowly. We remember your kindness every day. You handled our hate, our hunger, our hearts. We live free because you believed we were human when others saw only enemy. Please find enclosed a photograph of us beneath a cherry tree in bloom. When you see cherry blossoms, remember 5 friends in Japan who pray for your happiness. With deepest gratitude, Aiko, Reina, Yumi, Sachiko, and Nara." The photograph showed the 5 women standing together beneath a cloud of pink blossoms. They were dressed in civilian clothes now, no longer prisoners, but simply women restored to their lives. Their faces were smiling, at peace despite the difficult times their country faced. Caleb studied each face, remembering their voices, their courage, their small kindnesses during those strange weeks of guard and guarded. Emotion welled up, catching him by surprise. They had survived. They were home. Something good had come from the horror of war. He carried the letter and photograph to church that Sunday. The cherry saplings his mother had planted were showing the first buds of spring, tiny promises of beauty to come. After the service, several veterans gathered outside, smoking and talking about news from overseas. The occupation of Japan, the trials of war criminals, the rebuilding efforts, topics that filled newspapers daily. One man, Edwards, who had fought in the Pacific, spoke harshly about the Japanese. "Can't trust any of them," he declared. "Animals, the lot of them, after what they did in the war." Caleb, who rarely spoke in these discussions, cleared his throat. The men turned, surprised. "I guarded Japanese prisoners," he said quietly. 5 women, nurses. The men waited, expecting a tale of treachery, perhaps. "They taught me their word for heart, kokoro," Caleb continued. "Taught me about courage, too. One of them jumped in front of a gun to protect me." Silence fell over the group. Edwards shifted uncomfortably. "Got a letter from them yesterday," Caleb said, pulling out the photograph. "They're home in Kyoto, rebuilding, just like we're all trying to do." He passed the photograph around. The men studied it, their expressions changing as they saw not enemies but simply women standing under flowering trees. "Pretty," one of them finally said. "The blossoms, I mean." "Cherry trees," Caleb said, "like the ones we planted here." He gestured to the saplings near the church fence. "They gave you seeds?" Edwards asked, his harsh tone softened. Caleb nodded. "Aiko did. Said someday they'd bloom and remind me that beauty comes back after the darkest times." The men fell silent again, perhaps thinking of their own dark times during the war, their own journeys home. "Reckon she was right about that," said Johnson, a quiet man who had lost an arm at Okinawa. "Beauty does come back." A few months later, the cherry saplings had grown stronger, reaching toward the summer sun. Caleb tended them carefully, weeding and watering with gentle hands. Next spring, they might bloom for the first time, a splash of pink against the red Georgia clay. One warm Sunday, after the morning service, Pastor Reeves asked Caleb to speak to the congregation. Veterans and their families had gathered for a special service of thanksgiving and remembrance. Caleb wasn't one for public speaking, but he agreed. Standing before his friends and neighbors, many of whom had known him since childhood, he spoke simply about his experiences. "I went to war thinking I knew who the enemy was," he began. "Had it all figured out. Americans good, Japanese bad. Simple." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Then I got assigned to guard 5 Japanese women, prisoners. They were supposed to be the enemy, but all I saw were people scared and far from home, just like I was." He told the story of the storms, the shared food, the language lessons. He described Aiko jumping in front of the gun and the paper cranes they'd made while waiting for peace. "They taught me that mercy isn't just something we talk about in church," he said. "It's something we do, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." As he spoke, Caleb noticed some of the older church members nodding. Mrs. Johnson, who had lost a son at Pearl Harbor, wiped tears from her eyes. Pastor Reeves smiled encouragingly. "When we planted those cherry trees out back," Caleb continued, "some folks wondered why we'd want Japanese trees in our Georgia churchyard. But I think they belong here. They remind us that healing starts with small things. A kind word, a shared meal, a seed planted in faith." He pulled the embroidered kokoro cloth from his pocket. "This means heart in Japanese," he explained. "They gave it to me when we parted, because in the end, that's what matters most, not which side we fought on, but whether we kept our hearts open through the fighting." When he finished speaking, there was silence. Then Mrs. Johnson stood up slowly, leaning on her cane. "Those women," she said, her voice quavering, "are they all right, after the bombs and all?" "Yes, ma'am," Caleb answered. "They're in Kyoto. They wrote to me." She nodded. "Good," she said simply. "That's good." Later, many people approached Caleb, shaking his hand or embracing him. Even those who had whispered about his fraternizing with the enemy seemed touched by his story. "You done right, son," Mr. Peterson said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Not easy to see past the uniform to the person wearing it, in war or peace." As the crowd dispersed, Caleb walked to the cherry saplings. They stood like promises against the church fence, slender, vulnerable, but alive. In Japan, similar trees grew in parks and temple yards, along rivers and mountain paths. The same sun shone on them all. He placed Aiko's photograph inside his Bible, alongside the embroidered kokoro cloth. Sacred things, these tokens of friendship forged in the crucible of war. Reminders that even in humanity's darkest hours, light found ways to shine through. The seasons turned, bringing autumn then winter to Georgia. Christmas came, the first peacetime Christmas in years. Caleb joined the church in collecting gifts for war orphans overseas, small acts of healing in a wounded world. And through it all, he tended the cherry saplings, protecting them from frost with burlap, checking their slender trunks for strength. They were dormant now, conserving energy for spring's renewal. Much like hope itself, Caleb thought. Sometimes it waited quietly below the surface, gathering strength for the moment when it could burst forth again in beauty. In early spring of 1946, the first cherry sapling bloomed beside the church fence. Just a few delicate pink blossoms, but they drew everyone's attention. Children asked about the unusual trees. Veterans stopped to look thoughtfully at the flowers. Church ladies arranged cuttings in vases for the altar. On a particularly fine Sunday, the congregation gathered outside after service. Pastor Reeves suggested they hold an impromptu Thanksgiving beneath the blooming tree. People joined hands in a circle, heads bowed as he prayed for continued healing for their community and for the world. Caleb stood in that circle, feeling the warm hands of neighbors in his. Above them, pink petals occasionally floated down, landing softly on shoulders and heads like gentle blessings. When the prayer ended, 7-year-old Tommy Jenkins looked up at the blossoms in wonder. "They're pretty," he said. "Where'd they come from?" Caleb knelt beside the boy. "From very far away," he explained. "From Japan." Tommy's forehead wrinkled. "But weren't they our enemies?" Caleb considered how to answer. "They were," he said carefully. "But now the war is over, and we're all just people trying to make a better world." He pointed to the delicate blossoms. "These trees remind us that beautiful things can grow after hard times." Tommy seemed to think about this. "Like how Dad lost his leg, but he can still play catch with me?" Caleb smiled. "Exactly like that." As people drifted away, Caleb remained beneath the tree. He took out Aiko's photograph, looking at the 5 women standing under similar blossoms an ocean away. He wondered how they were doing, if they were finding their way forward in a changed Japan. "You handled all 5 of us," he remembered Davis mocking when he'd first received his assignment. The words had been meant to sting, to diminish. But standing under Georgia's first Japanese cherry blossoms, Caleb knew the truth. He hadn't handled the women at all. They had met as supposed enemies and parted as friends, handling fear, prejudice, and war's divisions together. Pastor Reeves approached, his Bible under his arm. "Beautiful sight," he said, nodding toward the blossoms. "Yes, sir," Caleb agreed. "Thinking about them?" the pastor asked, gesturing to the photograph in Caleb's hand. "Wondering how they're doing," Caleb admitted. "Japan's having a hard time." Pastor Reeves nodded. "But they've got strong spirits, those ladies. Like you said in your talk, good kokoro." Caleb smiled at hearing the Japanese word from his pastor's mouth. "Yes, sir. The strongest." As they walked back toward the church, petals drifting around them like snow, Pastor Reeves patted Caleb's shoulder. You know, son, some might say it was just chance. You getting assigned to guard those women. But I think the Lord had a hand in it. How's that, Pastor? Sometimes He puts us exactly where we need to be, not just for others' sake, but for our own growth too. You taught those women about mercy, and they taught you that enemies are only enemies until you see their humanity. Caleb finished. A lesson this whole world needs to learn, the pastor said thoughtfully. Maybe these trees will help teach it in their own quiet way. As spring fully arrived, more blossoms appeared on all the saplings. People from neighboring towns drove by to see the unusual sight. Japanese cherry trees blooming beside a small Baptist church in Georgia. Some came with questions, and Caleb found himself telling the story again and again. Not the full story. Some details remained private, sacred memories he kept close to his heart. But enough to help people understand that healing could grow from the most unlikely soil. One afternoon, as Caleb sat on the church steps reading, a black car pulled up. A man in a suit stepped out, camera in hand. Mr. Turner? He called. I'm from the Augusta Chronicle. Heard about your cherry trees. Wondering if I might take a picture, ask a few questions? Caleb hesitated. He'd avoided publicity, preferring to keep his experiences personal. But Pastor Reeves, watering flowers nearby, caught his eye and nodded encouragingly. Might do some good, the pastor said quietly. People need stories of hope these days. So Caleb agreed, showing the reporter the blooming trees, explaining their origin as a gift from women he had once guarded. He spoke simply about finding common ground despite language barriers, about small kindnesses exchanged amid war's cruelties. The reporter seemed moved. Mind if I take your picture by the trees? Caleb stood beneath the largest sapling, pink blossoms framing his thoughtful face. As the camera clicked, he held in his hand the embroidered kokoro cloth, a private reminder of the journey that had brought these trees to Georgia soil. A week later, the story appeared in the newspaper. Seeds of Peace. Japanese cherry trees bloom in Georgia churchyard. The article told of Sergeant Caleb Turner's unusual wartime assignment and the friendship that had grown across enemy lines. Letters began arriving at the church, some from veterans who had similar stories of unexpected connections made during the war. Others from people who had lost loved ones but found comfort in the idea of reconciliation. One letter came from a Japanese-American family who had spent the war years in an internment camp. They wrote of their struggles to rebuild their lives amid lingering prejudice. Your story gives us hope, they wrote. If cherry trees can bloom in Georgia, perhaps understanding can grow in America. Caleb answered each letter carefully, turning down invitations to speak or give interviews. He had never sought attention for what he considered simple human decency, but the cherry trees continued their quiet witness, blooming each spring with increasing abundance. Children played beneath them after church. Couples took photographs among the blossoms. Veterans sat in their shade, perhaps finding peace in the beauty that transcended national boundaries. And Caleb, watching it all, kept in his Bible the evidence of a promise fulfilled. 5 women standing under cherry blossoms in distant Japan, and the single word that had bridged worlds torn apart by war. Kokoro. Heart. As petals drifted on the gentle Georgia breeze, he knew that this was how healing happened. Not in grand gestures or peace treaties alone, but in the 1,000 small acts of recognition that beneath our different uniforms, languages, and loyalties, we share a common humanity. This was the message the cherry trees whispered each spring. That beauty returns, that life continues, that hope blooms even after the harshest winters of the human soul. The years passed like turning pages. 1950 arrived with its own troubles, whispers of new conflicts in distant places, fears of different enemies. But in Augusta, Georgia, the cherry trees continued their faithful blooming each spring. Caleb had built a good life. He managed the lumberyard now, having worked his way up from yard hand. On Sundays, he still sang in the church choir. He'd even started courting Sarah Mitchell, the sweet-voiced music teacher who had come to town 3 years before. Yet memories of the war remained with him, especially each spring when the cherry blossoms appeared. He still kept Aiko's letter and photograph in his Bible, along with the embroidered kokoro cloth, treasured reminders of connections that had survived against all odds. One crisp March morning, Caleb arrived at church early to help prepare for Sunday service. Pastor Reeves, now gray-haired but still spry, met him with an unusual expression. "Got something for you, Caleb?" he said, holding out an envelope with foreign stamps. "Came to the church address?" Caleb's heart quickened as he recognized Japanese characters alongside English writing. It had been nearly 5 years since he'd received any news from across the Pacific. "Thank you, Pastor," he said quietly, slipping the letter into his pocket. Whatever it contained, he wanted to read it privately. Later, sitting beneath the largest cherry tree, now tall enough to cast real shade, Caleb carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written in elegant English and a photograph. "Dear Sergeant Turner," the letter began. "It has been many years since we last wrote. Much has changed in Japan. The occupation continues, but our country rebuilds slowly. We hope this letter finds you well and at peace. You may wonder why we write now, after so long. Last month, an American magazine published an article about Japanese cherry trees growing in American soil. There was a photograph of a man standing beneath blossoms at a church in Georgia. Though older, we recognized you immediately. The article told of a soldier who guarded Japanese prisoners with kindness, who planted seeds of peace when others sowed hatred. Reading this story brought happy tears to us all. The seeds you planted have grown strong, just like the seeds we gave you. We have enclosed a new photograph. We 5 still meet each spring when the cherry trees bloom in Kyoto. We remember the young sergeant with the kind eyes who saw beyond our enemy uniforms to our human hearts. Japan and America are finding new paths forward. Perhaps one day, true friendship will grow between our nations, just as it grew between us in that small camp so long ago. With enduring gratitude and respect, Aiko, Reina, Yumi, Sachiko, and Nara. Caleb studied the new photograph. The 5 women stood under cherry blossoms again, older now, their faces showing the years that had passed. But their eyes still held the same strength he remembered, the same dignity that had impressed him during those strange weeks of guard duty. He noticed that Aiko now wore a wedding ring. Yumi held a small child. They had continued living, building new chapters after war's devastating interruption. A sudden thought struck him. The magazine they mentioned. He hadn't given any interviews, but that small piece in the Augusta Chronicle had been picked up by other publications. Somehow, the story had traveled across the ocean, carrying unexpected seeds of its own. "Everything all right?" Pastor Reeves asked, approaching with concern on his face. Caleb nodded, handing him the letter. "More than all right," he said. "The women in Japan, they saw a story about our trees." The pastor read the letter, smiling. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said, a phrase he often repeated. But this time, Caleb felt its truth deeply. That evening, Caleb showed the letter to Sarah as they walked beneath the cherry trees after choir practice. She had heard the story before, of course. Everyone in town knew about Caleb's cherry trees, but the new connection moved her deeply. It's like a circle, she said thoughtfully. You planted their seeds here, and the story traveled back to them. Never expected that, Caleb admitted. Just tried to do what was right at the time. Sarah took his hand, her fingers warm against his. That's why I love you, Caleb Turner. You do what's right without thinking about whether anyone will notice. Her casual mention of love made his heart skip. They had been courting steadily, but neither had spoken that word yet. I've been thinking, he said carefully, about the future. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the late afternoon sunlight. What about it? Under the canopy of Japanese blossoms in Georgia soil, Caleb asked Sarah Mitchell to be his wife. Her joyful acceptance scattered pink petals around them as she threw her arms around his neck. Later, writing a reply to the women in Japan, Caleb included his own news. His upcoming marriage, the continuing growth of the trees, the unexpected connections their story had made. The seeds you gave me have become part of my life's story, he wrote. Each spring, they remind our whole town that beauty can grow from the most unlikely beginnings, like our friendship. As summer approached, news from across the world grew troubling again. A new conflict had erupted in Korea, another distant Asian land where Americans were now fighting. The newspapers filled with reports of communists and containment, of strategic villages and supply lines. For many in Augusta, it stirred uncomfortable memories of the last war. For others, particularly young men just reaching adulthood, it stirred a desire to enlist, to serve as their fathers had. Caleb felt the weight of these developments as he helped 18-year-old Johnny Williams load lumber onto his father's truck. Johnny had just signed up and would leave for basic training the following week. Bet you saw plenty of action in the Pacific, Mr. Turner, Johnny said, eyes bright with youthful eagerness. Got any advice for a new recruit? Caleb considered carefully. This boy, barely a man, looked at war through the lens of adventure, of patriotic duty. How could Caleb share the complex truth without diminishing the genuine honor in Johnny's choice to serve? Remember that the people on the other side are human too, he finally said. Do your duty, follow orders, but don't lose sight of your own humanity. Johnny looked confused. But they're communists, the enemy. Yes, Caleb acknowledged, but they're also sons, brothers, fathers, just like our boys. He placed a hand on Johnny's shoulder. Fighting for what you believe in is honorable. Just don't let it turn your heart hard. The boy nodded uncertainly. Caleb walked him to the truck, then added one more thought. Take care of the fellows in your unit, and let them take care of you. The bonds you form there, they'll stay with you for life. As Johnny drove away, Caleb gazed down the street toward the church, where the cherry trees were now full of green leaves, their spring blossoms long gone. 5 trees, planted in faith, growing strong through the years. Just like 5 women, once enemies, now friends across vast distances. That fall, Caleb and Sarah married in a simple ceremony at the church. The cherry trees, their leaves turning gold in the autumn light, stood as silent witnesses. Sarah had suggested they marry in spring under the blossoms, but Caleb wanted to begin their life together without waiting. Besides, he told her, this way we can look forward to celebrating our anniversary and the blooming of the trees separately. 2 blessings instead of 1. Pastor Reeves, officiating at the wedding, included a special prayer. Lord, as Caleb and Sarah begin their journey together, we thank you for the lessons this good man has taught our community, about seeing the humanity in others, about planting seeds of peace in war-torn soil, about the healing that comes through simple acts of kindness. At the reception, held in the churchyard, Sarah surprised Caleb with a special gift, a handmade quilt with 5 cherry trees embroidered in the center, surrounded by the words faith, hope, love, and, in careful Japanese characters, kokoro. Mrs. Johnson helped me with it, Sarah explained, watching his face as he traced the delicate stitching. She said it was her way of healing old wounds. Caleb was deeply touched. Mrs. Johnson, who had lost her son at Pearl Harbor, had struggled the most with the idea of Japanese cherry trees in the churchyard. That she had helped create this wedding gift spoke volumes about her own journey toward peace. As husband and wife began their life together, the wider world continued its troubled course. The Korean conflict escalated. Cold War tensions grew. New fears and prejudices took root alongside the old. But in their small corner of Georgia, Caleb and Sarah Turner created a home built on the foundations of faith, compassion, and the belief that human connections could transcend the artificial boundaries of nation, race, and circumstance. Their first child, a daughter, arrived in the spring of 1952. They named her Grace Sakura Turner, Grace for God's unearned favor, Sakura for the cherry blossoms that had become such an important part of their story. When Grace was 4 days old, Caleb carried her outside to see her first cherry blossoms. The trees were in full bloom, more magnificent each year as they matured. Standing beneath their canopy, he whispered to his tiny daughter, "These trees have a story, little one. Someday, I'll tell you all about it." That same spring, another letter arrived from Japan. Aiko and the others sent congratulations on the birth of Grace, along with a tiny silk kimono for the baby. "Children are the bridges to the future," Aiko wrote. "May your daughter grow in a world more peaceful than the one we knew." As the years passed, the trees and Grace grew together. By the time she was 5, Grace knew the cherry trees were special. "Daddy's trees," she called them, climbing fearlessly among their branches. "Why do we have Japanese trees?" she asked one day, having heard someone comment on their origin. Caleb lifted her into his arms, looking into her curious face. "Because beauty belongs to everyone," he said, "not just to one country or one people." She accepted this answer easily, as children do. But as she grew older, Caleb shared more of the story with her. About the war, about 5 women far from home, about kindness offered when it wasn't expected. "Were you scared to be nice to them?" 8-year-old Grace asked. "Since they were supposed to be enemies?" "Sometimes," Caleb admitted. "But being afraid isn't a good reason not to do what's right." By the time Grace was 12, the trees had become a local landmark. Church groups from neighboring towns would visit during blossom season. School children came on field trips to hear Mr. Turner's cherry tree story. Sometimes veterans brought their families, seeking healing for old wounds through the simple beauty of pink blossoms against southern skies. Caleb never sought this attention, but he accepted it gracefully. If his story helped others find their way toward reconciliation, he was glad to share it. In 1964, nearly 20 years after the war's end, an unexpected visitor arrived in Augusta. The Japanese consul from Atlanta had heard about the cherry trees and requested to visit them as part of a goodwill tour. The town prepared excitedly for this diplomatic occasion. The mayor would speak. The high school band would play. It would be, everyone agreed, an honor for their small community to host such an important visitor. The morning of the visit dawned clear and bright. The cherry trees, now tall and strong, wore their finest spring display. Townspeople gathered at the church, dressed in Sunday best despite it being a Wednesday. Caleb, now in his 40s with touches of gray at his temples, stood quietly to one side with Sarah and 13-year-old Grace. He felt strangely nervous. This official visit seemed to place a weight of importance on what had been, for him, a personal story of connection across dividing lines. The consul's car arrived precisely on schedule. Mr. Tanaka stepped out, a dignified man in a formal suit. He greeted the mayor and other officials with polite bows. The high school band played both the American and Japanese national anthems. Then Mr. Tanaka asked to meet the man who had planted the cherry trees. Caleb stepped forward, extending his hand. "Mr. Turner," the consul said with a deep bow. "It is an honor to meet you. Your trees have become a symbol of friendship between our nations." "The honor is mine, sir," Caleb replied. "But I should tell you, the seeds came from Japan. I just planted them." Mr. Tanaka smiled. "That is often how the most beautiful things grow. One person offers seeds, another plants them in fertile ground." As they walked among the trees, the consul asked about their origin. Caleb shared the story of the 5 women he had guarded, of Aiko's gift of seeds before they parted. "Have you maintained contact with these women?" Mr. Tanaka asked. "Yes, sir. We exchange letters occasionally," Caleb said. "They're all well, I believe. They still meet each spring under the cherry trees in Kyoto." The consul seemed moved by this ongoing connection. In Japan, cherry blossoms represent the beauty and fragility of life. They remind us that moments of grace, though fleeting, can leave lasting impressions. He studied Caleb thoughtfully. "What you did, showing kindness to those women during war. This was not a small thing, Mr. Turner. Such acts of humanity, when everything pushes toward hatred, these are what save us from our worst selves." After the formal ceremonies ended, Mr. Tanaka spoke privately with Caleb again. "My government has a program that sponsors cultural exchanges," he explained. "We bring Americans to Japan to strengthen ties between our countries. Would you consider such a journey, Mr. Turner? To see the cherry trees of Japan yourself?" Caleb was stunned by the invitation. I'd be honored," he managed to say. "But there would be expenses." "The program would cover all costs," Mr. Tanaka assured him. "For you and your family. We believe your story deserves to be known in Japan as well as America." That evening, Caleb discussed the incredible offer with Sarah and Grace. To visit Japan, to possibly reunite with the 5 women after all these years, it seemed almost too wonderful to imagine. "We have to go, Daddy," Grace said excitedly. "I want to meet the ladies from your stories." Sarah squeezed his hand. "It's a gift, Caleb, a chance to complete the circle." 3 months later, the Turner family found themselves on a plane bound for Tokyo. Grace pressed her face to the window, marveling at the Pacific Ocean passing far below, the same waters that had once separated people now carrying them toward reunion. Caleb felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. 20 years had passed. Would the women remember him as clearly as he remembered them? Would the reality match the connection he had preserved in his heart? Their first days in Japan were a whirlwind of official welcomes and sightseeing. Mr. Tanaka's office had arranged a comprehensive tour: temples in Tokyo, the Peace Memorial in Hiroshima, cultural demonstrations of tea ceremony and flower arrangement. Everywhere they went, people treated them with warm hospitality. Many had heard their story through advance publicity about their visit. Some approached Caleb with tears in their eyes, thanking him for his kindness to their countrywomen during the war. "So many stories from that time are of cruelty," one elderly man told him through an interpreter. "Yours gives us hope for humanity." Finally, their journey took them to Kyoto, the ancient capital city that had been spared bombing during the war. It was here, in a small restaurant near a famous temple, that the reunion would take place. As their car approached the meeting place, Caleb felt his heart pounding. Sarah reached over to straighten his tie, smiling encouragingly. "They'll be just as nervous as you," she reminded him. Grace, now 14 and growing into a thoughtful young woman, watched her father with understanding beyond her years. "It's going to be wonderful, Daddy," she said. "Like your story coming full circle." The restaurant had been reserved for their private meeting. When they stepped inside, 5 women stood waiting. 20 years older than when he'd last seen them, yet instantly recognizable. Aiko, her hair now streaked with silver, stepped forward first. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, decades falling away in shared memory. "Sergeant Turner," she said softly, her English much improved, "you came to Japan." "Caleb," he corrected gently. "Please call me Caleb." She nodded, then surprised him with an American-style handshake rather than a bow. "Caleb," she said, the name sounding musical in her accent. "Welcome to our country. We have waited many years for this day." One by one, the others greeted him. Reina, still quiet, but with warm eyes. Yumi, now with laugh lines around her mouth. Sachiko, elegant in a traditional kimono. Nara, who had been the youngest, now a confident middle-aged woman. They had all brought their families, husbands, children, even a few grandchildren. Caleb introduced Sarah and Grace, who bowed politely as they had been taught. The afternoon became a celebration. They shared a traditional Japanese meal, exchanged gifts, and most importantly, stories. Through interpreters and their own improved English, the women filled in the missing years. Their struggles after returning to a defeated Japan, their marriages, careers, and children. "We were lucky," Aiko explained. "Many Japanese women lost husbands, brothers, fathers, but we had survived. We had seen kindness from an American. This gave us hope to rebuild." Reina, who had once drawn Caleb's portrait in the POW camp, presented him with a new drawing. The 5 women and Caleb standing together beneath cherry trees, half in Georgia, half in Japan. "2 worlds connected," she explained simply. Nara's teenage son, who spoke excellent English, served as translator when the conversation grew complex. "My mother says," he relayed, "that when she tells people about you, they often don't believe that an American soldier could have been so kind to Japanese prisoners." "It wasn't so unusual," Caleb said modestly. "Many soldiers showed humanity when they could." "But not all," Aiko interjected. "What you did, it was a choice. You chose to see us as people first, enemies second." After the meal, they walked together to a nearby park, famous for its cherry trees. Though it wasn't blooming season, the trees stood tall and graceful against the autumn sky. "In spring," Yumi told Grace, "these trees are like pink clouds. We meet here every year to remember your father's kindness." "He planted your trees in our churchyard," Grace replied. "They're beautiful every spring." Sachiko, who had spoken little during the meal, finally addressed Caleb directly. "After war, many Japanese hated Americans," she said carefully. "Many Americans hated Japanese, but hate cannot rebuild. Only friendship, only kokoro." "Kokoro," Caleb repeated, the familiar word bringing tears to his eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the embroidered cloth they had given him 20 years before. "I've kept this always." Aiko touched the cloth gently. "And we kept this," she said, producing a yellowed photograph. Caleb in his uniform, standing at attention beside their bamboo hut. "To remember that even in war, humanity can survive." As the afternoon light began to fade, they reluctantly prepared to part. Promises were made to write more often, to share photographs of grandchildren, to keep the connection strong. Before saying goodbye, they gathered beneath the largest cherry tree. A photographer from the Japanese-American Cultural Exchange Program captured the moment. 5 Japanese women and 1 American soldier, once divided by war, now united in friendship. "Sakura," Aiko said, pointing to the tree above them. Cherry blossoms fall quickly, reminding us life is short, but the tree remains, growing stronger each year. She took Caleb's hand in her smaller one. Like our friendship. That night, back in their hotel room, Grace sat on the edge of her parents' bed, thoughtful. "Daddy," she said, "when I grow up, I want to work bringing people together, like you did." Caleb smiled at his daughter. "I didn't do anything special, Gracie. Just tried to be kind when it wasn't easy." "That is special," she insisted. "The ladies said lots of people chose hate instead." Sarah, brushing her hair nearby, nodded. "Your father's always been that way, Grace. Seeing people as people, not as labels." Later, unable to sleep, Caleb stood by the hotel window, looking out at the lights of Kyoto. This land, once an enemy territory on maps and in briefings, had become a place of profound personal connection for him. The next day, their final one in Japan, brought an unexpected honor. The mayor of Kyoto invited them to participate in a small ceremony. A new cherry tree would be planted in a peace garden, dedicated to friendship between nations once at war. Standing beside the freshly dug hole, shovel in hand, Caleb found himself addressing the small, gathered crowd. Though he had never sought public attention for his story, he felt moved to speak from the heart. "Trees have roots that run deep," he said, the interpreter translating his words into Japanese. "They weather storms and seasons, but they keep growing, keep reaching for the light." He looked at Aiko and the other women standing nearby. "Like trees, friendship can endure hardship and distance. What we plant today, both this tree and the renewed bonds between us, will continue growing long after we're gone." Together with the 5 women, Caleb placed the young cherry sapling into the earth. Each person added a handful of soil, a symbolic sharing of the planting. As the mayor spoke about peace and reconciliation, Caleb stood with his arm around Grace's shoulders. He thought of all the springs to come, when this tree would bloom in Japan while its cousins flowered in Georgia. A synchronized reminder that beauty knows no boundaries. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a small plaque. In both Japanese and English, it read, "This tree celebrates the friendship between Sergeant Caleb Turner and Aiko Tanaka, Reina Ito, Yumi Kobayashi, Sachiko Matsumoto, and Nara Yamamoto. Proof that human connection can transcend war's divisions. May it inspire peace for generations to come." Seeing their story commemorated this way moved Caleb deeply. What had begun as a simple act of kindness during war's darkness had grown into something larger than himself. A living testament to the possibility of reconciliation. Their journey home took them back across the vast Pacific. As the plane cruised high above the ocean that had once been a battleground, Caleb gazed out at the clouds below. So much had changed in 20 years. Former enemies were now allies. Trade flowed where warships had once patrolled. And yet, he knew, the true healing happened not between nations, but between people, in small acts of recognition, in choices to see beyond uniform and flag to the shared humanity beneath. Upon their return to Augusta, the Turner family found themselves minor celebrities. The local newspaper ran a front-page story about their journey. Church members welcomed them with eager questions about Japan and the reunion. The following spring, when the cherry trees bloomed again beside the church, their beauty seemed even more meaningful to Caleb. Now he had seen their counterparts in their native soil. Now the circle was complete. Visitors still came to see the trees and hear their story, but increasingly it was Grace who told it, adding the details of their journey to Japan, of the friendship that had survived decades and distance. As Grace grew into a young woman, she chose to study international relations in college. "Your cherry trees inspired me, Dad," she told Caleb when she announced her decision. "I want to help build bridges between cultures." Caleb couldn't have been prouder. His daughter would carry forward the legacy of understanding that had begun in those strange, grace-filled weeks in a prisoner of war camp so long ago. Over the years, letters continued to flow between Georgia and Japan. The women sent news of grandchildren born, of retirement celebrated, of life's continuing journey. Caleb replied with updates on Grace's education, on new spring blossoms, on the growing recognition of their shared story. Then, in 1970, 25 years after the war's end, Caleb received a letter bearing sad news. Eiko, the brave woman who had jumped in front of a gun to protect him, had passed away after a brief illness. "Her last wish," her daughter wrote, "was that we send you these seeds from her own cherry tree. She said, 'The circle must continue. We hope you will plant them and remember her.'" With Grace home from college to help, Caleb planted Eiko's seeds in a special corner of the churchyard. As they worked the soil together, he shared memories of the strong-spirited woman who had taught him the word kokoro and shown him the meaning of courage. "She called you the American with the kind eyes," Grace told him. "She told me that when we visited. Said she knew from the first day that you were different." Caleb smiled at this revelation. "She never mentioned that. She said some things are too important to say until the right moment," Grace replied, patting the earth gently around the newly planted seeds. The following spring, tiny shoots appeared, Eiko's legacy taking root in Georgia soil. And, on the other side of the world, Caleb knew the tree he had helped plant in Kyoto would be blooming again, its blossoms a testament to connections that transcended time and distance. As he watched his daughter tend the new saplings, Caleb reflected on the strange, winding path his life had taken. A simple assignment, one guard for 5 prisoners, had opened a door to understanding that changed not only his life, but rippled outward to touch countless others. "You can handle all 5 of us?" Davis had mocked all those years ago, never imagining that handling would become caring, that duty would transform into friendship, that seeds carried across oceans would grow into living symbols of peace. Standing in the dappled light beneath cherry blossoms, some now 25 years old, others just beginning, Caleb felt profound gratitude. For the women who had taught him about strength and dignity in captivity, for the chance to plant seeds of reconciliation in war-torn soil, for the daughter who would carry these lessons into a new generation. As petals drifted down around him like gentle blessings, Caleb Turner looked up through branches reaching toward heaven, finding in their beauty the answer to a prayer offered long ago in a distant prison camp. That even in humanity's darkest hours, light could still shine through. And in that light, all things were possible: healing, forgiveness, and the slow, steady growth of peace.